I'm Nick Dembowski. I'm the interim director here at Van Cortlandt House. Glad everyone could be here. My interest in local history was sparked by finding out about the events of the American Revolution in the area. But I started uncovering all these documents pertaining to slavery and enslaved people, and it really sparked my interest because it's just not something that local historians had ever really delved into before. And I've found documents such as this, looking through newspaper archives. $5 reward. Run away from the subscriber, the 27th April last, living at Kings Bridge, an elderly Negro fellow named Jack. About 6 feet high, bald-pated, guinea-marked, etc., speaks good English, and has a smattering both of French and Dutch, lived formerly on Staten Island. Had on when he went away a gray homespun jacket and breeches, with a pair of coarse toe-cloth trousers. Any person that secures the said Negro so that the owner may have him again shall be entitled to the above reward and all reasonable charges paid by I.G. Titard. Note well, as the fellow has formerly been a sailor, he may probably take to sea. Therefore, all captains of vessels are forewarned carrying him off at their peril. And this type of record represents about the most information you're going to get about an enslaved person living in this area. And even though this is more information we'll have about nearly any other enslaved individual, it does make you want to know more, because this sounds like an epic life, really. I mean, he's an older person. He's guinea marked, so that means that he was branded as when he entered the slave trade in Africa. 3 different languages, lived in different parts of the city, and he was a sailor, so he probably saw the world.
What was the year?
This, 1760s. No, 1774. 1774. And other sorts of documents that we're glad to have, even though they don't give us a whole lot of information, are census documents. So, Township of Yonkers, that's, in colonial times we are sitting in the Township of Yonkers. And what you have is a census list that shows the first 3 columns are the white residents. This 4th column is all other free persons. And the last one says slaves. And this is our neighborhood here. And, if you look at this in conjunction with a contemporary map, you can see the path of the census taker and get an idea of where some of these people live. This is a 1781 British intelligence map from the American Revolution. And you see up here the name Lawrence. That's just over the border in Yonkers. This is the Hudson River. So this is North Riverdale up here. So you see Samuel Lawrence right there. And a family with 5 enslaved people living there. And if you go down the list, you'll see the Warners, and here are the Warners. So you can follow the path of the census taker and get an idea of where these different people lived. And you can use these names to go, dig up wills. And if the will is detailed enough, it will give you the names of some of the enslaved people that were living at those properties.
17.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're sitting on this property, Augustus Van Cortlandt. 1 adult male, 4 females, 17 enslaved. This household above, Frederick Van Cortlandt Esquire, that was the other Van Cortlandt house, which no longer stands. That's this. This was up on 238th Street and Waldo Avenue. If you know Riverdale well, there's a pizza shop on that corner. This was that house. And this is Frederick Van Cortlandt II's house. He had, he would have had a large enslaved servant staff as well at that house, and he had a rock quarry. Perhaps some of the enslaved were working at the rock quarry. And, you can take those documents and start digging around in the wills. And the Van Cortlandt wills reveal names and sometimes occupations. So this is the will of Frederick Van Cortlandt I, who had this house built in 1749. I do also give and bequeath unto my said son James the following Negro slaves to wit: Piero the miller and Hester his wife, and little Peter the son of Piero, with my Indian man Caesar and Kate his wife. Item I give and bequeath unto my daughter Anne the Negro girl called Hannah, and to my daughter Eve the Negro girl called Sarah. And so this is, one of the worst aspects of a horrible situation, which is the splitting up of families at the death of the owner. On my said eldest son James, wherefore I give and bequeath unto him, my said son James, my mill boat with the canoe and appurtenances unto them and each of them belonging, also my Negro man Levely the boatman, with all and singular my wagons, carts, plows, harrows, tools, and utensils of husbandry. And so this, just the way the language reads, you can tell the perspective of the writer that the people are viewed as property, along with the other items listed. But one thing that we get out of this is multiple skilled laborers listed on working on this property. Piero the miller, milling was a skilled occupation. These are the Van Cortlandt mills before they burned down around the turn of the century, which stood at the base of what we had been calling Van Cortlandt Lake, but is now called Hester and Piero's Mill Pond. Some thoughtful person thought to save the millstone from the mill and embed it at the bottom of the stairs. And so milling was an occupation that required a lot of expertise, because you weren't just dumping grain into a machine, you were charged with maintaining that machine, which would have meant carving those grooves, pulling up a giant, I don't even know how much that weighs, a giant millstone, and it's called dressing the stone, carving those grooves in there and recalibrating the stones so that they're less than a centimeter apart from one another, spinning evenly. So this is a contemporary artist's depiction of Piero working in the mill with his son Peter. And he probably likely was an apprentice himself of a miller at some point. I haven't been able to delve into the name Piero to find out if it indicates his place of origin or place of birth. So about 2019, 2020, I started going to local parks community board meetings, and I realized that a lot of the things that people were talking about at those meetings, preserving the lake was one thing that people were very upset about, that there was going to be a paving of the trail and they were afraid the lake was going to get polluted. And people talked about maintaining the trails, the old dirt trails. And it made me think, as I'm listening to these people talk, that they don't even realize they are appreciating the legacy of enslaved people that worked here. For this lake was not a lake, it was a stream, and it was dammed up by the enslaved people. And we don't have any record saying they did that, but we have 17 people here, and we have one man who's a merchant and a lawyer, so it just stands to reason who did the actual work. And same with the roads. So there were, New York Colony didn't have a Department of Transportation that was sending people out to build these roads. It was up to the local landowner. So this path, which runs along the house, and we can all go out and check this out immediately after this presentation, is an old colonial path. And, before the Van Cortlandts, because the Van Cortlandts weren't the first colonists to move up here. There was, during Dutch times, there was Adrian van der Donck. He was a prominent colonist who settled right on this ridge that we're on. And after him, there were, after the English takeover of New Netherland, there were English settlers that moved to the area. So one of them was George Tippett. And his house, I believe, was right about here. And digging around in his documents pertaining to George Tippett was found a state inventory from 1675 showing a debt to Barnes Corse of New York for one Negro. So 1675, that's the earliest enslaved individual I've been able to find that lived here. But, that was just one of many, or several houses, I should say, up here in Van Cortlandt Park. This is a 1684 map that is, it seems random that it's owned by the Collegiate Church Corporation. But it's a gorgeous map. I went down there and took some photos of it. But just to orient yourself, this is northern Manhattan here. Here's the Hudson River, Spuyten Duyvil, Riverdale. And the part I wanted to see the most, right down the middle, is where there's this tear where they had to fold it over and glue it. So, of course, I'm missing the part I'm most interested in. But up here in, is my pointer on there? No, my pointer is not on there. So if you look towards the top part, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 structures, all above a ridge line. That's the swampy area to the south of it. So, I think that green line there is literally a representation of the ridge that's right beyond this house. And we have a census from 1698. And you can take the names of these households, Samuel Hickox, George Tippett, Johannes Van Scherich, Susanna Betts, and you can follow their path too. This census taker's starting at the bottom there, sort of to the southeast, and walking through to all these different households. And most of the smaller farmers' households, enslaved people are not held there, with the exception of George Tippett and his wife Joan. Johannes Van Scherich, I've inferred that was the caretaker or the overseer of the Van Cortlandt property, because the Van Cortlandt, their first purchase was between the Tippetts and the Betts families. So these are the Betts families here, the Tippett families here, and perhaps this is the Van Cortlandt, or this is. But the Van Cortlandts weren't living here. Jacobus Van Cortlandt was a merchant. And feel free to jump in with any questions. We're a small group. That's absolutely fine. Where was he from? Where was who from?
Van Cortlandt.
The Van Cortlandt family comes from the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. So the first generation of Van Cortlandts, Olaf Stevens Van Cortlandt, they were entirely based downtown in Lower Manhattan. One of the sons, Jacobus Van Cortlandt, two-time mayor of New York City, he was the one who started buying land in this area. And so he was buying up all these little farms. And, if you're the kind of person to go look at land deeds, you will see that he bought up each one of these people, Hope Still Betts, Samuel Betts, in different years. And, the deeds, since there's no block and lot numbers, they're using the neighbors as, to tell you where to situate the property relative to the neighbors. So you get an idea of who was living next to who, and you could pretty much put together who was living in each one of these houses.
I do want to ask.
Yes.
So this seems very close to the time that this area is being first settled. So is there like a difference in politics or how things were run between the first surveyors and the first wave of indentured servants from the Netherlands?
So, all right, to go back a little bit. So the first colonist to settle up here, Adrian van der Donck, he purchased this land from the indigenous people in 1646, although we don't have that deed. So there could have been all sorts of stipulations and deals and special points negotiated in that deed. I suspect there were, because the native people continued to live here for 100 years after that first purchase. And so Van der Donck, he was not just a colonist settling in the frontier, he was what was called a patroon. And the patroonship system was a system whereby the Dutch government would give land to a person, and that person would be charged with populating it. So Van der Donck went back to the Netherlands, and he hired all sorts of people, barrel makers, tile makers, farmers, and he brought them to this property. I don't have an exact number of people that were living here in the 1650s when they came back to the New World, but that his colony was called Cortlandt by him, which means Donck's colony, and he had grand ambitions for it, but they came to a crashing halt in 1653, I believe, which is when the Susquehannock fighters came and did a raid on Lower New Netherland. Was that 1653, Don?
I think so.
And there are records from after that event where there's some of those indentured servants or workers that were here. For Van der Donck, their children are in the orphanage, and there's another record of so the children in the orphanage, and it says the record for the orphanage indicates that the parents were killed at Verdonk's. So we're also on a site of a massacre, and Van der Donck was unique among people of his day in that he had some respect for the native people. He lived among them upstate when he worked as a scout, which means something like a sheriff. And there's one document that shows that he had a local indigenous person taking care of his cattle, for example. So he's likely to have had good relations with the local indigenous people, but this raiding party from Pennsylvania wouldn't have known him from any other individual. Yes?
The slide previous has the earliest image of a Dykeman house on it that I've ever seen. To the right of the word post. That's not the farmhouse that's there now. That's the one that lasted until the Revolution. Probably close to when it was built.
Yeah, this map's amazing.
Yeah.
And also, I'll get to this later, but towards the northern tip of Manhattan, this would be today's Marble Hill. That word says ferry. This is before there was the King's Bridge.
Yeah.
So this neighborhood would not have been known as King's Bridge.
That could be the waiting place too.
Could be the waiting place. So that was, before there was a ferry, when the tides were calm and low, people would just walk across here or, drive their cattle across. And over here, this is Tippett's Brook. And there's a label there. It says Ota Kill. So the first part of that word is cut off, but that's likely Muscoda Kill.
Oh, yeah.
So that was the term for Tippett's Brook that you see in all the deeds, Muscuda or Muscoda, as opposed to what people later thought it was Mashaloo, but Mashaloo seems to have been an error based on a British mapmaker during the Revolution who saw Muscata Kill, and they're transcribing and copying these maps because they're in England copying maps, and they miscopy Muscoda as Mashaloo, and then suddenly there's Mashaloo. So people in the neighborhood that are looking to, name parts of the neighborhood in the 1800s, they're going back and looking at these revolutionary maps, and they say, oh, wow, Mashaloo, that's the name for Tippett's Brook, so we're going to call this place Mashaloo. We'll have the Mashaloo train station, the Mashaloo post office, and so. I mean, it's a great name that I would hate to get rid of, but it does not mean Tippett's Brook. So often I look at the house itself and I think, how possible was this place without slavery? And there's, the very basic, elements of taking care of the house, heating a house like this. This house is huge. It's you know, six times what a normal person's house might be, your average local farmer. You know, just to heat it, someone would have to be, carrying bundles of wood up and down the stairs all night. To bring fresh water in, someone's going to be carrying buckets of water up the stairs, emptying chamber pots. There's no plumbing, and not to mention all the cooking and cleaning. But there's also the economics of how possible it was. You know, to say the Van Cortlandts profited from slavery is perhaps, is an understatement. This is from an account book of Jacobus Van Cortlandt, 1698. So even in that time, it says here, I received yours of the 2nd of April last by the sloop Dolphin. I have received as also the money and Negro man sent by said sloop. The Negro is sold for 40 pounds. So in 1698, the Van Cortlandts in New York are engaged in buying and selling people. And that's may not seem like a lot of people, one person. But if you look at above, look at what else they're selling: rum, cotton, indigo, sugar. So all these are, commodities that are coming out of the New World that are entirely dependent on slavery, for profitability. And then later generations of Van Cortlandt, still the Dolphin. This is the ship captain, Jonathan Marston, and the Van Cortlandts married into the Marston family. It was here in 1729. So this is a ship. Investors were Peter and Augustus Jay, so John Jay's dad, Peter Valet, Frederick Van Cortlandt, who had this house built, and Nathaniel Marston. They're bringing 25 people into the port of New York from Barbados. Now,
You said John Jay as in Supreme Court?
yes. Mm-hmm. And the Jays were related to the Van Cortlandts by marriage. So this is a relatively high number compared to what you're seeing in terms of ships coming into New York Harbor at the time. One thing I wanted to see if I could find, that I haven't figured out how to do this yet, but to find the equivalent type of account in Barbados itself, to see were ships offloading greater numbers of people in Barbados and bringing the rest up here.
Which could have been separate families along well.
Oh, sure. And these are the 25 that survived.
So Barbados is also a big hub for Dutch trade for enslaved. The Phillips have a plantation there that's focused primarily on the slave trade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's another way to think about the connections of the family to the slave trade is their relationship with other families like the Phillipses. So, Frederick Van Cortlandt is the grandson of Frederick Phillips, and he inherited ships from Frederick Phillips. And in fact, Frederick Phillips's wife, who was also a merchant, Margaret Hardenbrook, she owned a ship called the Dolphin. So this could have been a ship passed down. What's that?
Adolf still has the Dolphin.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so this, even after the rise.
Adolf is the son of Frederick Phillips. So Frederick Phillips was another. Was he a patrolman? He was a lord. He was a lord. Yeah. So very similar though. And his property came all the way down to Van Cortlandt Park. If you walked out the stairs and just looked across the street, 250 First Street is the southern boundary of his property that went from there up to the Croton River.
That number 25. How does that relate to the 17 that we saw?
So,
These are unrelated? Thank you.
I don't know. But I don't have
I
anything.
didn't see the date, I'm sorry. I didn't connect.
Okay, so the 17 people, that was a 1790 census.
Oh, okay.
And this is around the 1730s.
Okay.
So this is around the time, so these people were likely sold on the open market.
Gotcha. Thank you.
This is around the time that you see a runaway from Jacobus Van Cortlandt. Ran away the 18th of August, 1733, from Jacobus Van Cortlandt of the city of New York, a Negro man slave named Andrew Saxton. A tall, lusty fellow, is very black, walks stooping and somewhat lamish with his left leg. The thumb of his left hand is somewhat stiff by a wound he had in his hand formerly. The shirts he had with him and on his back are marked with a cross on the left breast. He professeth himself to be a Roman Catholic, speaks very good English, is a carpenter and cooper by trade, and has with him a broad axe, a 2-foot rule, and a hollow howl. He had on a pair of linen or Osnaburg breeches and an old cloth coat, but 'tis uncertain what other clothes he has with him. Whoever takes up and secures the said Negro man and gives notice thereof to his said master, so as he may be had again, shall have 40 shillings if taken within 10 miles of the city of New York, and £3 if further, as a reward, and all reasonable charges paid by Jacobus Van Cortlandt. So yet another example of a skilled laborer who, you know, he ran. Yes.
So I see a last name here.
Yes,
Saxton.
How early in your research do you find last names?
Not very often, but I you know what, I have to go back and really look that up for you. But this person is a real mystery to me. That name, Andrew Saxton, and then to be a Roman Catholic at a time where it was basically illegal to practice Catholicism in New York City.
Yeah, but that also means he's coming out of Congo where they were Catholic.
Could mean that. Mm-hmm. There was.
We're importing directly from Congo and Angola for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And there were also people, free black people that were captured off of Spanish ships at sea when the Spanish and the English were at war. And in New York City, there was a lot of them. They were known as the Spanish Negroes. And they were at the center of this revolt in 1741, which one of the Van Cortlandts, an enslaved person held by the Van Cortlandts was also caught up in that. That's Sam. Sorry about the text size here. I'm just going to read this to you. Confession of Sam, Negro of Colonel Frederick Van Cortlandt, before one of the judges. So there was this insurrection downtown, and one of the Van Cortlandts, this man Sam, was put on trial after the insurrection was brought to a halt. This is what Sam said. He said that sometime last fall, being at the house of John Hewson, who was a tavern keeper on the west side, who, contrary to all public law, allowed white people and black people to drink in his tavern, which was illegal. He asked the examinant whether he would be concerned with him to burn the town and kill the white people. That the examinant consented. That thereupon he gave the examinant a dram and told him he expected he would be as good as his word, and he answered yes. That about a fortnight after he met with Pompey, who was Mr. Peter Delancey's Negro, and carried him to Hewson's. And when they were there, they and Hewson drank a mug of punch, after which Hewson asked Pompey whether they would consent to stand on his side against the white people. So Sam offers this confession. And the result for Sam was that he was merely exiled to the island of Madeira, which is in the Atlantic Ocean. But many of the fellows who didn't confess, and the white tavern keeper, and another person who was accused of being a Catholic priest, they were gibbeted, which means they were hung up in medieval torture style, until they just died. And so it's a horrible chapter in the history of New York City.
And what's the year?
This is 1741.
Another.
So one thing about this area that we're in right here, right now, is that we're fortunate that it was mapped dozens of times during the American Revolution, because it was essentially the front line between the British and the Patriots at different times in the war. So here's a unfinished 1778 map that I found at the University of Michigan that you know, there's the Cortlandt house right there, that little L-shaped building. This would have been their barn. This is the Albany Post Road, or pretty close to Broadway. But you can see just how many buildings there are in 1778 immediately in the vicinity. Two of these buildings belong to someone named Isaac Lau, who was a representative from the state of New York to the first, not Constitutional Convention, what's the other one? Continental Congress, thank you. And his property, his houses were torn down during the war by the British, who needed the wood to build barracks. So during the war, he wrote to the British government to get compensation. And he wrote, let's see, this is the British government writing back to him. He wrote that, you know, it cost him £400, his house, to have it built, not including the cartage, labor of several Negroes, and timber and lath which were given him by Colonel Van Cortlandt. So this speaks to something else that was going on with the enslaved population here, is that they were being rented out, essentially, to do labor. And this is something that happened in New York City, that caused incredible strife and antagonism between laborers and white laborers and the enslaved people, because white manual laborers are trying to get work, and these slave owners are, you know, undercutting, driving down the, you know, the value of their labor. Another fascinating feature of Van Cortlandt Park is the old Kingsbridge burial ground. Now, this is something that really got me hooked on local history, was researching this. These headstones were sort of floating around the Van Cortlandt house for a long time. They had been knocked down and removed from the burial ground. And right after this, we can go over and have a look if you'd like. So I wanted to figure out what there was out there about this burial ground. So I went up to the Westchester County Archives. This place was once part of Westchester County, to find out what I could. And the librarian there just happened to be writing a book about Bronx cemeteries. So I said, hey, what, do you know this one? And he said, no, I don't know that one. But he's an amazing researcher, and within a week, he showed this to me. When the New York and Northern Railroad, now the Putnam Division of the New York Central, was cut through, it nearly annihilated this old cemetery, referring to that cemetery. It did succeed in going directly through another burying ground a short distance to the eastward, and a number of skeletons were exhumed. From the shape and size of these, it was thought that they were once Negroes, perhaps the slaves employed on the neighboring estates. And this is not enough information to satisfy anyone, and it's not a primary source. It's happening decades after the railroad was put through. But I'm sure if you've been to the park, you know this lovely place. This is before the paving of the trail. But this is that railroad, the New York and Northern Railroad, that later became the Putnam branch. And so I went to the Yonkers Library, where they have all the old Yonkers Statesman newspapers on microfilm, and said, well, this is not going to be that hard. Just figure out when did the railroad get built, and then, you know, get an article and learn what there is to know. But it took them 10 years to build the railroad, and it kept on changing hands in the middle of construction, and it didn't start running until, you know, years after it was finished. So I basically had to scan through a decade of newspapers, and eventually I found this. It was under the heading Railroad Matters. The New York and Northern Railroad Company have purchased a gravel bed covering an area of about 7 acres, constituting a portion of the Van Cortlandt estate near Mosholu or South Yonkers. In digging for gravel, human bones were found. These are supposed to be the remains of slaves once owned by the Van Cortlandt family. Caleb Van Tassel of Yonkers, now 84 years old, about 50 years ago made a coffin for a slave who was buried near the Van Cortlandt mansion. And this is all there is. And it's under the title Railroad Matters. And I was very happy to find the record that after a long search, but it sank in that this is just pathetically little information. But this is the best we have. Caleb Van Tassel, he was a miller who worked in those mills at the mill pond, and he lived in Van Cortlandt Park.
Made of coffee.
Mm-hmm. Made a coffin.
Unusual, right?
I don't think it was unusual for enslaved people to be buried in
It's
coffins.
pretty common. That's why today when we look at such sites, it's good to look for indentions in the earth because those coffins sometimes would collapse and the earth on top of it would conform. So that's what you look for those indentions in the earth.
Mm-hmm. They had used coffins in Africa. And of course, you saw in that census, this was not the only household, where enslaved people were kept. There's just a few blocks away, there's the Hadley House, 5122 Post Road. This was in fact, a house that was part of Phillipsburg Manor. So this was property owned by Frederick Phillips and occupied by tenant farmers. At the time of the Revolution, there was a tenant farmer named Isaac Green living there with his family, and you see enslaved people present then. And then the following family, the Hadleys, they kept enslaved people there as well. Moving around the neighborhood, if you're local, you recognize this corner. This might be, other than Van Cortlandt, the most historic corner in the area. Yes. So this was a property also owned by Frederick Phillips, where he had a tavern built. There's an 1818 watercolor by Jacques Milbert, showing that tavern property. And you can see West 230th Street was once the Spite and Ivel Creek. And you can see people fishing for oysters and canoeing there. That was a tavern owned by Frederick Phillips. And Frederick Phillips had his, force of enslaved laborers making buildings for him on his various properties. This tavern was also a place where at least one enslaved person was sold. James Bernard Inholder was a tenant of Frederick Phillips. You can see just barely, because it's on that seam, a building there. This is 1684, but that tavern was built by an act of the colonial government, and it was owned by someone named Johannes Vervelin, who was also given the right to move his ferry to this spot. He had his ferry at Harlem, but the currents weren't so good, so they moved it up to Spite and Ivel. And, we have a Vervelin Street down there. And we always assumed Vervelin, well, he's the ferry man, right? Well, when you think about it, okay, he has a tavern, he has a ferry, he has property downtown. Maybe he wasn't the ferryman. And it turns out, back when in 1667, there's a record of when the ferry was down in Harlem that it was an enslaved man named Mathis who was the pilot of the ferry. So, Vervelin there's a ship that comes into New Amsterdam Harbor in the last days of New Amsterdam called the Sparrow or the Moosh. And I believe that's the ship that carried 350 people enslaved people, Africans, into New Amsterdam at the very end of Dutch rule. And this man, Johannes Vervelin, purchased one of them. And I think perhaps this was that ferryman, Mathis. And so in a city that's known for its ferries and its bridges, this is our first bridge to Manhattan, the King's Bridge. And this was owned also by Frederick Phillips. He had the right to charge a toll on this bridge as long as he built it. And of course, it wouldn't have been him building it, but probably the work of the enslaved people that were kept in this area by Phillips. So think about that. I mean, you've probably heard that enslaved people built the wall that Wall Street is named after. They also likely built the first bridge to Manhattan. There's another look at the King's Bridge, looking south towards Marble Hill. St. Stephen's Church still stands. This was not dated. This was not dated. Back to this map. Looking on the other side of the Albany Post Road, so if we're here, your Burger King is about here, and across, or maybe up the hill a little bit, perhaps about where Horace Mann School is, or a couple of houses, I figured out that someone named Leonard Brown lived there. And Leonard Brown, in his will, leaves these instructions. In the name of God, amen, I, Leonard Brown, of the Yonkers, in the county of Westchester, do order that my 2 mulatto children, Robert and Mary, shall be free. And I do by these my last will and testament make my 2 children absolutely free forever. And this will, I've never seen such repetitious language in a will before, but he keeps repeating this. These kids are free. These kids are free. And he says, my son Robert, I leave in the care of Charles Warner to be brought up to the age of 15. So Charles Warner is a neighbor. To be brought up to the age of 15 years old and then put to any trade which he shall like best. And then he leaves money to Charles Warner for raising his son Robert. And then later in the will, he writes that he wants his an enslaved woman and then the 2 children of that enslaved woman sold at public auction. So it's just amazing to me that someone with, mixed race children, biracial children, would then go on and sell people, order these people sold at an auction. And I became very interested in this person, Robert, because I found his name again later on when I was researching the American Revolution. He's on the militia roll for 1775. And then I find 1790 census for the township of Yonkers, someone living in an area named Free Robert, who's no slaves for all other free persons living at the household of Free Robert. And the events of the American Revolution were, very tumultuous here in this neighborhood. I found a record of an enslaved woman who lived here at the Tippett house. This is on the Spite and Nival Creek. This is Gilbert Tippett's house. And he purchased a person named Violet in the 1760s. And then I wasn't able to find anything else about Violet. But I was able to, I found in the Book of Negroes, which is a book that the British colonial government kept at the, when they were leaving Manhattan at the end of the Revolution. They wrote down the names of all of the black people that were going with them to Canada. And so I found with Gilbert Tippett 2 children, Joe and Nancy, a stout boy and an incurably lame girl at that household, going with Tippett up to Canada, to Nova Scotia. And I just thought what a life that was, living through a war zone, perhaps without your parents, being taken to a different country. And then I wasn't able to figure out what happened to them because Gilbert Tippett moves back to New York in the early 1800s without Nancy and Joe. So they're somewhere up in Canada. After the war, you start to see more records of manumissions. So here's one. I, Alexander Macomb, of the city of New York, do by these presents for good and valuable considerations fully and absolutely manumit, make free, and set at liberty my Negro slave named Peter Pearson. And this is a person, Peter Pearson, that I saw on the census rolls for our area in the mid to late 1800s. And that name Peter Pearson really stuck out to me because it sounds so much like Peter Piero's son. And Peter Pearson was living with a woman named Hester, and that was another member of that family. So how could there possibly be a connection, though? This is Alexander Macomb manumitting Peter Pearson as opposed to a Van Cortlandt. Well, Alexander Macomb owned a giant grist mill down at Kingsbridge. Is it possible that Peter Pearson was trained as a miller and ended up working down at Macomb's mill at Kingsbridge? I don't know. We don't have that information.
So the means of Miller's side makes it more likely than Miller.
Yes.
You have to train a trade.
Mm-hmm.
You train the trade that is most likely for you to know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about who's manumitting. Does he leave money for him actually to be free? That's during the period of the bond.
It is not written here.
And why is he free?
Well, that's a good question, but it does say for good and valuable considerations.
He bought his freedom.
He may have purchased his freedom. Alexander Macomb was deeply in debt. He had purchased millions of acres upstate as an investment and thinking upstate New York was going to be the next, I don't know what, but it didn't pan out for him and he was deeply in debt. So he may have taken whatever money he could get. The Van Cortlandts themselves also did a number of manumissions. I hereby manumit and release from slavery my Negro man called Caesar, for his fidelity towards me, and for his honesty, sobriety, and industry. Item, my executors and the survivors of them are hereby authorized and required to place at interest out of my estate the sum of 500 Spanish mill dollars, or pieces of 8, and the said interest arising therefrom to be paid annually to my said Negro man called Caesar during his natural life. So these manumissions are happening towards the end of legal slavery in New York. This is Augustus Van Cortlandt, who lived in this house. I manumit my Negro slave Dinah in consideration of the great care and attention she paid to my deceased affectionate wife during her last illness. And at this time, of this manumission, 1821, according to the census, there were 16 free colored persons living on this property, and along with 3 slaves. And both of these people would have been close household servants to the family, and I do wonder what was left for all those other people that they weren't close to.
And also, what was their relationship?
What was their relationship?
You look at 3 enslaved in the same land. That could be just traumatic.
I have no idea how that could have.
And that was during the period when there was the gradual.
Yes, there was a gradual. What was it called? The gradual emancipation law.
So it also depends on the birth year of the people that
Mhm.
are not free by law. They may not have reached the age that they are able to be free. They may also not have had the skill set that the law requires them to have. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, what are we doing with this information? So in 2019, the beginning of 2019, as people were making plans for paving the Putnam Trail, I was in the middle of doing all this research, and I had, I'd asked the parks administrator at that time, like, there was this burial ground over here. And the burial ground had totally fallen off the radar. No one really knew about the enslaved African burial ground, and very few people had really paid attention to the other burial ground where European colonists would have been buried. So the I was told that, well, we got a SHPO report, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, and they approved the paving. I said, well, did they know about the burial ground? So I called them up, and they didn't know about the burial ground. Yeah, so the administrator at the time, Margot Perrin, she arranged to have soil scientists from the U.S. Department of Agriculture come in. And this is a ground penetrating radar, and he's scanning the area of the Putnam Trail. They also scanned inside the burial ground area as like a control. And what you see are they produce these reports that look like just colorful blobs, that are long, like a body, all sort of in the same direction. This is what the old burial ground looked like before. He was scanning in there, and to make his way back down to the trail, there's this little path that leads from the burial ground area to the trail. Let's see, can you see my pointer? No, you can't. Okay, well, the little path in the bottom, he's like, oh, I might as well just scan this as I head down. And so this is what his report turned up. Under the trail, these indications of that seem like possibly human burials up near the burial ground area. And I saw that, I was like, I thought it was really interesting, but having learned so much about all the massacres and burial grounds of our area, it didn't really stand out to me in any particular way. And I was giving a tour to a woman in the community, and I was telling her all about the burial ground. I said, oh, and by the way, this path we're standing on right now, there's bodies under here too. And she jumped off the path, and she's like, what are you talking about? And it just, a different perspective of, well, of course you don't walk on dead people and leave them under a trail. So Stephanie Ehrlich over here summoned the powers that be for a conference at the path, and the path was closed. The former Van Cortlandt Lake was renamed Hester and Piero's Mill Pond. The slave quarters of the Van Cortlandt House was opened up to the public, and it was the burial ground, the enslaved African burial ground, was consecrated on Juneteenth, the first ever Juneteenth ceremony. And a local artist interpreted the lives of the people that were here in a photo series, which turned out to be controversial, at least among some people in our community who hated this art. And listening to Kamau talk about it, he was saying that he felt that in order to fully humanize people, you show all aspects of their life, including the fact that they fell in love. And some of the community people that were helping advise us on how to interpret all this information really disliked this and said, why are you showing these people happy, smiling, looking at each other? You're whitewashing history. You're presenting a false story. And so that's part of our ongoing thinking about this. How do we present this information in a truthful, honest way, humanize the people, and let the community know about what is here under the ground and who was here living here. So that's the extent of my presentation.
And if I may, Nick,
Yeah.
you do what you're doing. You give the full range of human expression, human emotions, because without that, we continue to dehumanize them.
So let me play devil's advocate, though. Let's say you grew up, you went to a public school where your history class was, you're maybe of an earlier generation, your history class was George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. And there's no mention of these people, and the traumatic history of it was never taught as far as you're concerned. So to present this as your way of teaching the public, are you not making it more palatable for people to swallow?
No, we're embracing the fact that
They're human.
they are human. And one of the things that happens in the way enslavement has been taught in this country, we have only focused on the violence. We have only focused on the negative. And if that was the truth, then, or the full truth, we would have in New York, the second largest slave market in the 13 colonies, we would have thousands of mentally ill people running around. We don't have that. That in itself speaks to for me, the human seeking to find balance to maintain themselves within the system in which they find themselves. It also speaks to part of African traditional religions, which we don't talk about, which is the basis of what is good character. And good character, if you look at the Dakinga, if you look at the Orisha, if you look at any of the African traditions, it is about balance. Maintaining personal balance. And that's what makes hard, is that we don't study the African cultures. We don't look at the world where the enslaved came from. And we don't look at ourselves fully as humans that way. Everybody has that. But because we consider they were considered property by only looking at part of their characteristics, by only looking at the negative, by only looking at the most intense, we maintain them as property.
And if it's that only, well, yeah, I can see why people have an issue with that. But these enslaved people also had agency, as mentioned already. These people were human. They still loved. They still had family. Despite it all, anything beyond their acquiescence could have been the elimination of their gene pool. And as I look in this audience, some of us could not be here, sitting here today, had they not acquiesced and had the agency that they did to do the things that they did, despite all that was imposed on them. That's one of the reasons now in the lexicon we use the word enslaved instead of slave, to let the world know that these people didn't choose their fate.
Right.
It was this institution that made them the people that they were, and the people that they were are the folks that we now are. So I think we need to, be well-rounded in portraying and interpreting the lives of our enslaved ancestors.
Yeah, those are the types of conversations we've had, I would say, working with our community partners. There's in New York, there's a traditional holiday, Pinkster from the Pentecost, that Lovato knows all about because she worked up at Phillipsburg Manor, where they have a big celebration about Pinkster. And that's part of a culture that really was born here. Isn't that true?
It is, and it is the oldest documented African traditional celebration we have. But because it was outlawed, most people don't know about it. But the records talk about the presence of African languages. And even in the novels, in Satan's Toe, he talks about them laughing. Laughter heals. Laughter is a lot of things. But there is this much that people don't know. A lot of New Yorkers still don't know that there was enslavement in New York. We're very ahead of the game.
But I bring up Pinkster because that was another thing that some of our community partners didn't
Don't
want.
know.
They didn't like.
Right, why is there joy in the slave years? But I'm sorry, I haven't seen you in a year. I'm a little excited to see you. So I will be sad when I don't see you. But Pinkster is the only time in the year that people in New York can travel without a pass. They're given 3 to 5 days off. And when we see the structure of how some of the Pinkster celebrations are set up, it is the recreation of an African village. There's the placement of a Pinkster king. And it's not the lord of misrule. We forget that almost all African villages are royally led. But we have to study why Pink Pinster is Pentecost. Why is that important to them? Because most of them came out of the Congo, and most of them had been exposed to Christianity long before they got here.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't want to say that they were Christian because you're not supposed to enslave other Christians.
May I just add another point? You talk about education. So much of education is empathy. So if you bring something a similar relationship for children understand, when you're taken away, would you kill yourself? Would you just give up? Or do you find a source of survival and love and find joy to continue and grow? So even in the element of hate, I mean, we could be terrible right now from the hate that's continued in this country, in this globe. Different classes of people can be consumed with hate and give up. But when you have a history, a lineage of survival and growth, we have no place but to go and remain. Because you find a joy in that, you find a strength in that, you find a connection in that. And that is the spirit of each of us in that line. And that goes across any oppressed people.
Mm-hmm.
So see, the oppressor that you're naming who don't want to see us joyful, those are the oppressors' continued oppressive ways. Don't be happy. Don't be joyous. Don't have children. That's an oppressive value that we cannot support, nor should we take money from or any funding source from, because that's part of the continued escalation and devaluing of people. That's my thoughts.
I want to commend you for your research, because as I travel to a lot of sites like this, some say, well, we don't talk about it because we don't have information. That's bull. Because it's information that you already have, right? Just look at it differently, just as you did. You know, you look beyond all the joy of the enslavers in these documents, and sometimes they'll write a letter about the joy that they're having. Sometimes in that same letter, they may reference the enslaved people having a cell or some discipline that had to be administered. Pull that stuff out of there. And you got to, in these other sites, needs to do what you did and interpret it accordingly and add the narrative of those enslaved people into the already existing narrative. We're not trying to minimize the story, we're just trying to make it complete.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the story continues. I mean, the first time I ever came here, I was 10 years old on a field trip. And of course, that was a long time ago. And this was not talked about at all. You know, and then the next time I came, I was a teacher bringing a group here. And I didn't know anything then either, 20 years later. So I think that like coming here with a different lens, it's going to continue even past right now. There are other people that are going to interpret this because I've seen the iterations. And it's going to continue. Like even with looking at the axe marks, even when I tell people about all of these sites, that it's such a pride to say we built this and it's still standing. You know what I mean? Like, and no one ever said that. We just assume, oh, so and so built it. But when you're telling you, like, no, he didn't build it by himself. He didn't build it at all. So any of these sites, just to even say that, there's some pride in that. We built things that last. We had skills. We were skilled people. We learned things. The Cooper, the Miller, the boatman. And so I think that, but it's going to continue to evolve. The other thing I would say is we're also very image heavy, at least young people with Instagram and things like that. So because that's an image, a lot of the other things we don't have images for. So it kind of looms a little bit larger because it is a photograph than if you were to just, like if you had a photograph of the person who was giving, confessing to your uprising. If you had a photograph of, I tried to bring one of the young man who was in the militia. Like it really, that's another reason why there might be some criticism just because there's not a lot to balance it, as you were saying.
And thanks for mentioning the axe marks. Because one of the first things I did when I came up on the site, came to the site today for the first time, I started walking the outside of the buildings. Because I look for bricks, Looked for fingerprints in the bricks. Well, I didn't find any. But then I walked in here and saw those marks that you just referenced. Knowing that enslaved people, every stripe was an enslaved person putting those marks in those these beams that exist here to hold the structure up.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, just to speak to the points that a couple were making about the spirit to maintain the balance and the spirit. It was interesting looking at that, reading about that uprising that Sam was implicated in. That, you know, they were at this tavern, and that was where it happened. And the colonial laws of New York, they banned, you know, black people drinking in taverns like half a dozen times because they couldn't stop it, because people were getting together. You know, they were being people, you know, when they could. Mm-hmm.
Because the first band was after the first insurrection, and that was 1712.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Nevada?
The first band was after the first insurrection, and that was in 1712. New York had 2 slave insurrections. They don't teach that.
Speaking of insurrections,
Yeah, they do now.
I need to put in a shameless plug. Our conference, Slave Wallet Project conference this year is about, we're centering it around the Stoner Rebellion that happened in South Carolina near Charleston, 1739. But it goes beyond that. It goes about its rebellion, resistance, and there's another R in there somewhere. So we are looking for you and whoever else in you to submit to being a part of this conference so that we can highlight all that I just saw there, all that you are talking about. We want to bring this to the world, that we were not just sitting idly by, just waiting to be free. We were proactive in obtaining that freedom, whether it be through rebellion or whatever means necessary. We were there, and that has moved forward. This resistance, this rebellions that we had to take upon ourselves to obtain our own freedom and our own rights, because we have to think about the things that replace slavery. You know, like KKK and lynchings and convict labor and poll taxes and redlining and Jim Crow laws and black codes and disenfranchisement and massacres. We gotta, let the world know that slavery didn't, the ending of slavery did not give us that happiness that we're still pursuing. This nation that we're building is not a perfect union yet. And we have always had to do our part to kind of speed things along, to let folks know that, we are a nation, we're a great nation, but along the way we committed some atrocities. And those atrocities should be acknowledged.
Including the indigenous.
Definitely.
So I'd be happy to walk over to some of the places in the park that were in the slideshow if anyone's interested in seeing those, in person. So this is the burial ground. It's gone by a lot of names. The Tippett Burial Ground, because George Tippett, who lived in this area in, I think 1713, wrote, put a document in the county clerk's office stating that he was setting aside a 1/4 acre of land to be a burial ground for his family and the Betts family, and that this land had been used as a burial ground for a very long time. And he's writing that in 1713. So, this almost certainly goes back to the late 1600s. And, there's the old Putnam Trail there, the old Putnam Railroad line. And it was a bit of a mystery how, since we don't have great documentation, how there could have been skeletons dug up along the railroad. And I've come to think that perhaps they weren't actually under the path of the railroad. Because, when you're building a railroad, you're not necessarily digging, you're building up. And especially if it's on the bank of a pond, I'm thinking that they scraped land away from this hillside here to help prop up the bank of the mill pond. And so in scraping away soil, that's how they uncovered skeletons. There's still a few headstone fragments sticking out of the ground here. Over here. There's some here.
Wow.
And then there's other field stones. Some folks from the Historical Society mapped these out in the early 80s, and they found a lot.
Just a rock.
I don't know. Well, I don't know. So.
Well, they're just stones. Just stones. Nothing written. Nothing inscribed on these. Right?
There were a few that were inscribed, but they were apparently knocked over and vandalized in the 80s. So they were removed, brought over to the Van Cortlandt house behind the gate, and then they've since been taken downtown by, what division would that be? Stephanie would know. But they're going to restore them and put them in a nice case and put them on display somewhere to be determined.
The reason I ask,
Yes.
to be inscribed is an indication of education. Somebody being educated. And I don't know, what was the policy for educating enslaved people in New York?
You know what?
I know
There
in
were
southern
no
states.
laws against educating in New York. None at all. So that was that's one of our challenges, where people always assume, like in the South, there are those laws.
Mhm.
And Nick's example of the runaway ads, where you have people talking multiple languages and the skills and things. But we have some pretty severe slave codes in New York. None are related to education. And we do have around the state a few of the field stones that are inscribed, but we don't have very many.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this area, I'm pretty sure was where the white colonists were buried, because this is where the headstones that were inscribed were in this location. But as far as we know, there were no headstones for the enslaved people, but I'm not really sure.
So this area specifically has been marked off as a burial ground. It's just more recent. And there's some African burial ground
Yes.
as well. Is that
Mm-hmm. And then, this fence is not original to the burial ground. This was put in. Yeah, it's a Parks Department fence. So, it's not terribly surprising that they found bodies indicated outside of this fence. I mean, for all we know, they could be there or there. Let's go down to the lake, because it's the mill pond, I should say. Piecing together what life may have been like here is very difficult, given the documents that we have and what we know. But it did sort of occur to me that you have your African burial ground. You have this mill pond that was built with slave labor. You have an enslaved miller, Piero, working at a mill right down here with his son, maybe his wife also. Maybe Hester and Piero slept in the mill. And you have local laws that forbade large gatherings of black people, with the exception of burials. And I couldn't help but think that quite possibly this was a very important place for the local black community. You have a respected person in Piero here who's essentially running a business for the Van Cortlandts. You have a sacred space in the burial ground and a body of water built by the ancestors of those people that were here that this could have been a very special place in the local Black history of hundreds of years ago.
It was their home.
And it just also happens to be one of the most beautiful spots in the Bronx, especially when the leaves come in or in fall. So I'm so happy that we're commemorating the burial ground and the work of Piero and Hester. So.
Thank you for bringing them and others forward.
I mean, it was so in the Juneteenth ceremony. It was a real thrill to see, Chief Baba Neil Clark, I believe is his name. He was, reciting these names as he sprinkling water,
Pouring libations.
Yes, pouring libations, and to be reciting these names that we had found in these documents and names that really had been lost to history. And it was wonderful for the community, and so many people came out, and it was really meaningful for them to see that and hear that. So it was beautiful.
The shots that come out
Say that again?
the images, where were those taken? That come out?
So the two figures are along that colonial path that I pointed out.
Okay.
There's also just south of the house a depression area where there's, it's a little swampy down there at the bottom of the red steps. I believe he took some photos down there as well. That's where you can find the millstone, if you'd like to see that.
Is that your property over there? Where that gathering is?
That's part of the park, yes.
The reason I asked is I was on a plantation where they have weddings, which is quite controversial
Oh, yes.
to some. I'll put a period right there.
Well, that's it's interesting that you bring up the topic of weddings on plantations, because I got a call last week from someone from the community who is looking for a place that they could afford to have their wedding. And the policy of the Van Cortlandt House said a couple of years ago, I believe, was no weddings. And I believe that part of the decision had to do with the fact that news articles such as the one I read where you're quoted about weddings on plantations and the controversies around them. But I did feel somewhat, which I totally understand, but I did also feel somewhat ambivalent about telling a local person who sounded like a person of color, no, you can't have your wedding here. You're going to have to go rent someplace.
Yeah, the controversial, it's not going away. And I don't expect it to. Some folks ask me, well, how do you feel about weddings on plantations? Well, ultimately, I don't think it should happen. But if you look at the fact that I've gone to weddings on plantation of people who look like me getting married on plantations. I know a few Black folks who got married on a plantation, but it's usually because they have ancestral ties to that particular plantation. Most weddings on plantations now, they want to do it because of the atmosphere, the ambiance, the sights, the things that they see. Sometimes the things that they've learned, and sometimes those things that they've learned are kind of the Gone with the Wind type fantasy that they're seeking on these plantations. So, therefore, they will always happen, and the controversy will always be there.
With the plantation, wouldn't you factor in that most plantations have slaves that are buried there somewhere, unmarked? So would you choose a cemetery to have a wedding? And if you would choose one, there are plenty of other cemeteries. You see what I mean? I mean, if you put in a sense of there's death here, there's torture that's been here, there's a history of enslavement here. Why would you start a new life with the husband and wife there? I think that's a good way to put a. I'm sorry not to cut you off, but that's one of the challenges we have here
because the enslaved are on every square inch of New York.
Yes.
There is no land until you get into the Adirondacks that is not the home or the death or the place of enslavement. We are not plantation local. We are everywhere.
Right. But
We're on the farms, we're in the urban buildings. From City Hall, all of that land for Lower Manhattan is nothing but enslavement. So no matter where you get married in New York, you're standing on somebody.
Well, the plantation is more of a symbol of it.
Correct, but that's the problem, the challenge that we're having at sites in New York.
Okay.
And
It is
especially in a
everywhere.
public park too. I mean, the parade ground where today people were playing cricket and soccer, you know, there was a Native American village there, and there were skeletons dug up out of the ground as they were making that field.
And that's you just brought my point. In this controversy that will always be there is if we as African Americans are upset because weddings are being planned on plantations and done on plantations, overlay that with the Native American presence on all these places. So, you know, again, that adds to that controversy and to the conversation.
May I ask, what did they do with the remains when they dig them up for these purposes?
What did they do with the remains?
Yeah.
I wasn't able to find any records of what they did with the remains.
And or more currently, so like within the last 50 years when they come across human remains. Have they been consistent with preserving them at all, or just tossed out?
There is no protocol in New York State about what you do with human remains, and that's any remains. If you call the archaeological department and if you invite them in, particularly if it is private property, they will step in and do work for you. If you are doing a construction project, and again, depending on who's doing that construction, they may or may not call someone in. That is one of the conversations that is happening on the state level of what are we doing? Because everyone, you know, we think in terms of the enslaved, we think in terms of Native Americans, but also consider the families of tenant farmers had burial grounds on those farms. Those are being uncovered as well. We know, we have records of piles of bones, particularly like when Dykeman lost their cemetery. There are like newspaper pictures of bones sticking out of dirt. What happened to them? They threw them away.
And Don, you could probably speak a little bit to how people in the neighborhood reacted to the discoveries of those bones.
This is on 212th Street, 30 blocks or so south. And it was 1903 when 10th Avenue was being prepared for the elevated subway that's going to go over it, that there was the white cemetery and then a previously unknown black cemetery that was part of the construction damage. And so in 1903, the construction workers discovered 30 or 40 burials, and it made all the newspapers, and so the Museum of Natural History came, sent anthropology people, and took bones, and then the police captain from Kingsbridge was supposed to preserve things, but nothing happened, and everything just disappeared.
And they're still trying to get a marker for that grave.
Yeah.
That burial ground. They still don't have that.
There's one now.
There is. Good.
Yeah, there's been a lot of things happening in the last year. Shelter just did buy the land. Bought the land and hired archaeologists to check it out. But I didn't expect anything to be found because it had already been graded down 10 feet. It was a hillside, and now it's not. So the cemetery's gone. And then there's a public school right next to the property. The parking lot is actually part of the cemetery. And the public school and Dykeman went in on a monument. So there's a monument there now, and there's going to be more once the shelter is built. You have a space on the ground floor for a permanent something about it. Yeah.
So I'm quite cold. I don't know.
Yeah. We stressed.
Can we head back?